Welcome back everybody, hope you're doing well. So it's been a long time since I did a dedicated video about algae, so I thought, you know what, today let's do another one. So I basically wrote down a load of different tips and tricks to help you avoid and reduce algae. I think I have 28 of them, something like that, around 30. So I'm going to keep it as short and condensed as possible, and I'll also put timestamps on the timeline of the video so you can click to whichever tip or trick might be interesting to you. So let's get straight into it. Okay, I'm going to start with a very basic one. The first one is going to be regular water changes. I'm sure you heard it many times already. I still think it's important to talk about it. So for me, regular means once per week. I currently have 11 tanks up and running, and the majority of them will get a water change once per week. But I'm a little bit flexible as well, and it kind of depends on the state of the tank itself. If it's a very new setup, I might do multiple water changes in 1 week. And if it's a long running setup that's very stable and it's looking good, I might skip a week and I do it once in 2 weeks. I think the main takeaway here is to be regular with it. So find a time in your weekly schedule where you have the time to do some maintenance. For me, that's the Saturday mornings. Saturday mornings are not very busy for me. I don't really have any activities. So that's when I prefer to do my weekly water changes. And I usually change about 50%. And I think water changes are just great for reducing waste organics, reducing excess nutrients. So yeah, regular water changes is the first one. Then the second tip is all about when to do those water changes. And this is something I don't really hear a lot of people talk about. Maybe it's just something that I made up, but I think it makes sense. Just hear me out for a second. So I have my lights on from 1 p.m. till 9 p.m. on all of my tanks. So I prefer to do my water changes before that or after that, but preferably before that. See, the thing is, it's kind of mostly specific for tanks with CO2 injection. So just imagine that it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, yeah? The lights have been on for 2 hours, CO2 has been on for several hours as well. So the water is nicely saturated with CO2, pH is nice and low. During that time, you don't want to disturb that. So if you would do a water change in the middle of the day, then you would take out a bunch of that CO2 saturated water and replace it with tap water or RO water or just water that doesn't have CO2 in it. It's going to give you a huge swing in your pH, and that can definitely lead to algae issues as well. So I would say do your water changes either before or after the photo period. Okay, tip number 3 is to use some cycled filter media in your new setup. So I have quite a lot of filters up and running, so for me it's quite easy to open up one of those filters, take some media and use it in a new filter or in a new setup. And that's really going to help kickstart this new aquarium as well, because it's full of beneficial bacteria, and the more beneficial bacteria in a new setup is just going to make your life a lot easier. If you just have one tank, it's a bit more tricky of course, but you can go to your local community and ask some of your local aquarium hobbyists for some established filter media. Or you can go to your local fish shop and ask there. See, I was thinking, like if I would have a shop, I would just have a huge planted display tank in the middle of the store, fill the sump with biological filter media, and just sell some of that media to my local customers as well, you know, like why not? Why is that not a thing? But yeah, if you can do that, like just using some established filter media is really gonna kickstart this new setup, gonna give you a lot less algae issues as well. Then tip number 4, this one is very similar to tip number 3. It's another way to kind of kickstart your new setup. That's by using some old substrate. So substrate is also full of beneficial bacteria and it can really help kickstart a new tank. So for example, a month ago, I took down one of my nano tanks and I knew that a few days later I was going to set up a new tank again. So I saved some of the substrate and used it as a base layer in this new tank. And it did wonders. Like that tank is now 1 month old, didn't have any startup algae, didn't have any diatoms. I could add in the fish faster as well because the tank was already cycled. I didn't have any ammonia anymore. I didn't have any nitrites anymore. So yeah, if you can use some old substrate somehow, it's another really great way to kickstart your new setup. Now another really good way to avoid algae during the startup phase is by doing a dark start. I made a video about the dark start method a long time ago. Since then I haven't really talked about it anymore because this method doesn't really work for me as a content creator. It just takes a little bit too much time. But if you have the time, if you have the patience, then this is a really good method. So with a dark start, you basically fill up the tank with substrate, with your hardscape, so your rocks and your wood, and you also fill up with water, and you add your filter, but that's it. So no light and no plants either. So you basically cycle the tank like that for 3-4 weeks, something like that. And in that time, your filter can get established, you can get loads of beneficial bacteria in your substrate, Any nasty things from your hardscape can, leach into the water as well. And then after 3-4 weeks, you take out all the water, you get rid of it, then you plant it, you fill it back up, you add a light, and that's it. So after you are done with this dark start method, your aquarium basically already has a lot of beneficial bacteria. It's going to be very stable. You also got rid of any nasties from your hardscape. And if you're using Aquasoil, for example, then this method is especially great because you got rid of those excess nutrients that are released in the first few weeks. And you also avoided doing all those excessive water changes that are necessary with Aquasoil. So yeah, dark start, really good method. I really recommend it. Okay, the next one is something I talk about quite a lot, and that is to slowly increase your light intensity. So the majority of my lights here are all dimmable. And whenever I'm doing a new setup, I will usually start with a very moderate intensity, something like 60% for example. And as the weeks pass by, I will slowly increase that, let's say 5% per week or 10% per week. And the reason I do this is because in a new setup, plants are still adjusting, you don't really have a lot of plant mass just yet. Also, like new tanks are very susceptible to algae. So it's better to start with a very moderate intensity and just slowly build it up. And I will build it up until I'm either satisfied with the intensity or until I start seeing some algae. So if I start seeing some algae, then I know that I've kind of went too far. Now slightly dim it a bit again. And I always say that the light is the same as the gas pedal. So with more light, you just go faster. So you have to find the right speed and the right balance between light, CO2 and nutrients. So by slowly increasing it, you can kind of safely find the right balance in my opinion. So that's tip number 6, I think. Tip number 7 is to have a very consistent photo period. It kind of speaks for itself, kind of basic, but occasionally you still talk to some people who manually switch the light on, manually switch it off, then they forget to turn it off and the light is on the whole day. This is something that you want to automate. So I always recommend to use a timer or use lights that have an app so it's automated. And I always have my lights on from 1 p.m. until 9 p.m, 8-hour photo period. And you want to just keep it the same every single day, like your plants get used to that as well. In the evening you can see the plants close up. The next day they will open up again by the time it's almost time for the light to turn on. And if you would have different schedules every single day, your plants will just get confused and they will not be photosynthesizing when the lights are actually on. So that's just something you want to avoid. So tip number 7, consistent photo period. It's very important. Okay, the next few tips are all about plants. Tip number 8 is to use healthy plants. Sounds like common sense, but I still think it's important that we talk about this. So when you're buying plants, if you're going to a shop, you can kind of see the plant with your own eyes, you can inspect it. And if it's a potted plant, it's very easy to see if it's good quality or not. If it's a tissue culture pot or an in vitro pot, it's a little bit more difficult to see. And those tissue culture pots, they don't really have a very long shelf life. It kind of depends on the plant. For example, moss can last a very long time, but I've had issues with Monte Carlo that it would kind of turn to mush within a few days, So some plants don't really have a very long shelf life, so you want to inspect them properly. Also, if you're buying in a shop, I would always ask the shop owner, like, hey, when are you getting a fresh shipment of plants directly from the greenhouse? Then you can come in at the right time, get them as fresh as possible. If you're buying online, you can still do the same thing. You can send them an email like, hey guys, when are you getting fresh plants in? I think that's all I wanted to say actually. Tip number 8, use healthy, good quality, fresh plants. Then tip number 9, I talk about this one quite a lot. Tip number 9 is to use floating plants. In my opinion, floating plants are like a little cheat code to a healthy planted tank. So the good thing about floating plants is, first of all, they grow very fast. And fast-growing plants are like the worst enemy for algae. Floating plants also help soak up excess nutrients, and if you don't have excess nutrients, then algae can't grow. They're also able to take up CO2 from the air. And if you think of normal aquatic plants, they can only take up CO2 that's in the water column, but floating plants can take up CO2 from the air as well, so that's good. And floating plants also help kind of block some excess light. So if you're using a little bit too much light on your tank, adding some floating plants can just kind of help balance it out again. So I use floating plants in pretty much all my tanks actually, so it's tip number 9. Tip number 10 is to use some fast growing plants. I just mentioned that floating plants are really good against algae because they grow fast. and we also want to have some fast growing plants in the tank itself. I see this scenario a lot where beginners, they go to a shop and then the shop owner will recommend them Anubias and Java ferns and crypts. That's really good, but they always forget to recommend fast growing plants. And I guess it's because of maintenance or something, but yeah, fast growing plants just really help to establish the tank and just help to kind of prevent algae. I always use this analogy of there's like a war going on in your tank between plants and algae. And if you only have slow growing plants, then you're not really going to win that war. So use some fast growing plants. For example, Limnaphila sessiliflora is very good. What I have in a big shallow, the Heterantera zosterifolia is very fast growing. What else? Just stem plants in general, like Rotala rotundifolia is very good. Yeah, just Google fast growing plants, use a few of those in your tank and you're good to go. The next step is to use a lot of plants from the very beginning. This is a mistake that I made as well when I started this hobby. I just didn't buy enough plants. I just bought one pot of each type that I wanted because I thought, you know what, these plants are going to start growing and within a few months I will just have enough plants, you know. But the thing is, if you start with very little plants, it's very easy to run into algae issues because, again, coming back to that analogy, algae against plants, if you just have a few plants, then you're not going to win that battle, you know. So just make sure you get a decent amount of plants from the very beginning. If you add some fast growing and some floating plants, then you're on your way to success. Okay, this one is a tip for people that are currently struggling with algae. It's just a bit of a mindset shift. So this tip is to focus on growing healthy plants. Because I see this scenario a lot where people come to me for advice. They currently have algae and they're so busy in their head trying to figure out what's happening, how they can get rid of it, that they stop thinking about the plant itself. So if you just make that mindset shift and you start thinking about, hey, how can I make sure that my plants are healthy and my plants are growing? Then the hobby becomes a lot more enjoyable, because if you're too busy in your head focused on the algae, it's not fun, right? It's not fun to think about that. So if you just make the mindset shift, you start thinking about how can I make sure my plants are healthy, my plants are growing, then the algae will disappear by itself and the hobby becomes a lot more enjoyable. So kind of stop thinking about the algae, start thinking about your plants. So that's another tip. Okay, another tip is to avoid using rocks that increase the water hardness. So I'm talking about your classic Sirius stone, elderly rocks, Frodo, there's loads more. If you're not sure if these rocks increase the water hardness, you can always drop a little bit of vinegar on the rocks. If it starts fizzing, then you kind of know that these rocks will alter your water parameters. Whenever I'm using rocks like that, I always have more algae issues. And that's purely because, in general, most plants prefer soft water. So if you are using these rocks, the water will become more hard, plants will struggle, and algae will kind of have an easier time to grow. For example, right now I've recently set up a tank with rocks like that, just because I like them. But I already noticed that I need to inject a lot more CO2 just to get that drop checker nice and green, you know. So yeah, if you want to avoid algae, just try to stay away from those rocks. Go for lava rocks, go for dragon stones, also nice. Okay, another tip is to have a lot of nutrients in your substrate and very little nutrients in your water column. So if you look at plants can take up nutrients through their roots as well as through their leaves. But if you look at algae doesn't have roots, so the algae is only able to soak up nutrients from the water column. So if you make sure you have very little nutrients in the water column, then it's very difficult for algae to grow. So what I do is I use a very nutrient-rich substrate, aquasoil for example, and then I also supplement it with root taps. And then I just dose very, very little liquid fertilizer. So everything that I dose immediately goes to the plants. And there will be nothing left for the algae. So since I started doing that, I just had a lot better success with my tanks. Okay, kind of lost track of which number we're at right now, but here's another tip for the startup phase. So if you want to avoid or reduce algae issues in the startup phase, I would always suggest to wait with dosing liquid fertilizer. So if you think about it, like a freshly planted setup, those plants are still kind of adjusting to this new environment. And in that time, they don't really need much nutrients. Also, plants build up reserves, and they have some reserves from the greenhouse or from wherever they came from. and they're fine without nutrients for a few weeks. Especially if you're using Aquasol as a substrate, then the substrate will also release nutrients, and those nutrients will be plenty enough for the first few weeks. I've had some extreme cases where I used Aquasol as a substrate and I didn't use any liquid fertilizer for the first 2 months, and plants were growing just fine. So yeah, it's just another way to kind of keep the nutrients in the water column to a minimum, you know? So yeah, it's another tip. Okay, we're at tip number 16. Tip number 16 is to reduce your liquid fertilizer after you've trimmed your plants. And this is also something I don't really hear a lot of people talk about, but I think can actually make a bit of a difference. So if you think about it, after you trim your plants, the plant basically kind of stops growing for a few days. The plant is also experiencing some stress because you've just cut it, you've damaged the plant, and you've also taken out some plants. So you've reduced the amount of plants that are in your tank. So all those three things together, I mean, to me, it wouldn't really make sense to keep dosing the same amount of liquid fertilizer as before. So what I do after I trim my plants, I basically stop dosing just for like a week or so, because I've noticed that if I keep dosing the same amount of liquid fertilizer even after I've trimmed my plants, then I will always get a little bit more algae during those days where the plants are recovering, you know. So here's another tip for you. Okay, one more tip about fertilizer. Tip number 17 is to use the lean dosing method. So if we look at aquarium plant fertilizer, we can separate it into macro and micronutrients. The macronutrients are nitrate, phosphate, and potassium, and the micronutrients are iron, copper, and a bunch of other things, I don't know exactly. But with the lean dosing method, you basically only dose potassium and micronutrients. So you're not dosing nitrates and you're not dosing phosphates. The whole point of this is mostly to get those really reds, the beautiful reds in those stem plants, but it's also super helpful against algae because again, we're kind of limiting the amount of nutrients in the water column. Now this method works very well with a nutrient-rich substrate, so Aquasol for example. Without Aquasol, I'm not sure if it works that well, I haven't actually tried it. But I've recently actually switched to a new fertilizer that makes this lean dosing method much easier. It's the APT0. So this fertilizer contains potassium, iron, magnesium, and trace elements. So no nitrates in here and no phosphates in here. So super easy. I'll leave a link in the video description, plus a discount code as well. Yeah, the lean dosing method is not a really great trick to kind of help reduce your algae issues. Okay, I have another tip for the startup phase, and that is to wait with trimming your plants. Now this one is a little bit tricky, it doesn't always work, kind of depends on the situation, but if you are thinking of the startup phase, like the new setup of a new tank, this new tank is still very vulnerable, still balancing itself out, we're still growing those beneficial bacteria, we're still trying to grow a good plant mass, and if we start trimming the plants during that phase, it kind of leaves the tank vulnerable to algae. So what I would suggest is to wait with trimming your plants for as long as possible. I usually don't do a trimming session for the first month or so. But like I said, it depends on the situation. Like if the plants are growing really big and they're creating too much shadow and other plants are suffering, of course go ahead, trim the plants. But if you can delay it a little bit without any issues, I would suggest to do that, because if you delay it, then you're growing your plant mass faster, and also the plant mass is soaking up excess nutrients. So if you can delay your trimming session for as long as possible, I would suggest to do that. It's just a small little trick, but can actually make a big difference. Okay, another tip is to use a sterilizer during the startup phase. So the sterilizer is supposed to kill algae spores. It does a little bit more than that, but it's too much to explain in this video. I was very skeptical about this device, so I did an experiment on my channel where I set up 2 tanks in the exact same way. And one tank had a sterilizer and the other tank didn't have a sterilizer. And actually, like during the startup phase, there was quite a big difference between both tanks. The tank with the sterilizer definitely had less algae. I'm saying startup phase, I mean, I wouldn't use it after the startup phase. I don't think it really does much after that. It also doesn't really kill algae, it's just purely for prevention. So if you're thinking of buying this, use it for the startup phase, and that's it. Okay, I think we're at tip number 20. So tip number 20 is to have some basic knowledge about algae. If you want to have a successful planted tank, I think it's also important that you kind of have some basic knowledge of algae, just so you can kind of read the signs and just take action as soon as you start seeing the algae pop up. So for example, if you start seeing some green dust algae, you know, okay, green dust, maybe there's a little bit too much nutrients in the water column, let's reduce the liquid fertilizer a little bit. Or if you start seeing some blackbush algae, you know, blackbush algae is usually CO2 related, so let's kind of check the CO2 levels. Or if you start seeing some staghorn algae, staghorn is usually related to like too much waste organics, so maybe I need to do another cleaning session. What else do we have? Hair algae. Hair algae usually too much light, so maybe we need to reduce the light intensity a little bit. Something like that, you know, just so you have some basic knowledge of algae, just so you can anticipate it, and as soon as you see algae pop up, you can immediately take action. You don't have to go online, look for answers. Usually takes too long, and by then the aquarium is already completely infested. So tip number 20, have some basic knowledge of algae. Okay, tip number 21 is to lower your temperature. So in general, it's much easier to keep an algae-free aquarium in colder water, basically. So actually, most of my tanks are just at room temperature, which is like 21, 22 degrees Celsius. Most of my fish are totally fine with that. And the tanks that do have a heater is the Big Shallow, because I have some dwarf cichlids in there. They prefer a little bit warmer water. And my Betta tank. Bettas prefer warmer water as well. That one is set to 26 degrees Celsius. And I immediately noticed that in the Betta tank, it's much easier, it's much harder to keep it algae free. Just have a lot more algae growing, and I just need to do a little bit more maintenance to make sure that the tank stays nice and clean and the algae stays away. So if you can lower your temperature, just really depends on the fish, but yeah, colder water, it's much easier to keep it algae free. Okay, next tip is to make sure that you have good flow, good circulation. I think circulation is actually more important than filtration in the planted tank, because we have plants and we have a thick substrate that already does a lot of filtration for you. So circulation is very important, especially in tanks with CO2 injection, because we want to make sure that those CO2 microbubbles get distributed throughout the entire aquarium. So for that we need good circulation. And if you want to improve the circulation in your tank, I would always suggest to first look at your filter outflow. Because one thing I see happen a lot lately is that people use external canister filters with these big glass lily pipe outflows, which of course looks really good. I'm actually using them myself as well, but those big wide outflows do reduce the flow quite a bit. So if you think that you need a little bit more flow in your aquarium, I would actually suggest to switch to a bit more of a narrow outflow, so like a jet pipe, something like that. That would definitely improve the flow, improve the circulation, and yeah, circulation is important. That's tip number 22. Okay, red number 23. Tip number 23 is to try to avoid dead spots. Now, dead spots are basically places in the aquarium where there is no flow. And what happens when there is no flow? Waste is going to start building up there. And for example, you can see it in your aquarium where you have these like little piles of fish poop that are building up there. What's going to happen to that is it's going to start decomposing. It's going to start affecting your water parameters, and that will lead to algae. But another thing that happens with these dead spots, because there's no flow, there's also no nutrients and there's also no CO2. So when you have plants in those dead spots, those plants will start suffering and they will start getting covered in algae. So dead spots is something you want to avoid. And this is something that you can either fix with by improving your flow, but also by thinking about it when you're making your layout, your hardscape. Try to not have any like big pieces of hardscape that are obstructing the flow, just to make sure that you have a good circulation in your tank. Tip number 24 is keep your surface nice and clean. Something we all encounter once in a while is this filthy, oily surface layer on top of the water. I think it's basically just bacteria. But you want to try to avoid that as much as possible, because just a little bit is not really bad, but if it starts to become really thick, then it kind of prevents the gas exchange between the water and the air. So for example, if you're using CO2 in your aquarium, then that little surface layer is kind of preventing excess CO2 to disappear into the air. On the other hand, it's also preventing fresh air coming into the aquarium, so it kind of prevents fresh oxygen coming into your aquarium. So it's just something that you want to avoid. The easiest way to do that is just to run a little skimmer. So I use either glass lily pipes with a skimmer inlet, or I use the plastic Aquario Neo pipes, or sometimes I just have a little extra skimmer on the side. Yeah, just keep your surface nice and clean. That really helps to avoid algae as well. Tip number 25 is to use an algae cleanup crew. This was one that I mention all the time, but it's worth repeating. So just imagine that you have like a little group of, I don't know, 10 small workers in your tank that are constantly cleaning, like 24/7. So, I mean, it's basically all they do. For them, algae is food, so they're constantly cleaning it. It just makes a big difference, you know? Like you can do a lot of cleaning yourself, but just having a little algae cleanup crew on the side as well just really makes a big difference. So my favorite algae eaters are Otocinclus. They're very good at eating brown algae, greenhouse algae, stuff like that. Then the Mano shrimp, they're very good at eating green thread algae, green hair algae. And then I also like to use the Cliton snails, so the horned knee-round snails, because they are very good at eating black brush algae. So then you kind of have the 3 most common algae kind of taken care of, you know? So yeah, tip number 25, use an algae cleanup crew. Okay, the last 3 tips are all about CO2. So tip number 26 is use CO2. Of course, this one is a little bit tricky. Not everybody likes CO2. I also don't think you necessarily need CO2 to have a beautiful planted tank. For example, here the big XXL vase next to me doesn't have CO2. It still looks pretty good. But you are a little bit limited in the plants that you can use. So if you want to have a really beautiful planted tank with loads of different plants, I would always suggest to use CO2. Again, it's a little bit tricky. I mean, if you don't use CO2 in the proper way, it can also just lead to more algae issues. But in general, with CO2, your plants will grow healthier, your plants will grow better, and that will just make it a lot easier to keep CO2 at a distance. Tip number 27 is to turn on the CO2 earlier than the lights. This is something I still see happen quite often, is that people think that CO2 and light just needs to turn on at the exact same time. No, that's something that you want to avoid, because as soon as the light turns on, your plants want to start photosynthesizing. And to do that, they need CO2. So ideally, as soon as the light turns on, you want the water to be already quite saturated with CO2, so your plants can immediately get going. So, and kind of as a general rule, I like to turn on my CO2 1 hour before the lights turns on. And on big tanks, I actually turn on the CO2 2 hours before the lights. Same thing with turning it off as well. So on my small tanks, I will switch it off 1 hour before the light turns off. And on the big shallow, I think it switches off an hour and a half before the light turns off. So that's kind of like a general rule. So 1 hour on, 1 hour off. And then the last one, tip number 28, is to use a CO2 drop checker. So a CO2 drop checker is basically just a little glass vial that's filled with a liquid that reacts to your pH. So when you start injecting CO2, your pH will actually go down, and that will change the color of that liquid inside the CO2 drop checker. So yeah, it's very easy. Blue is too little, green is enough, and yellow is too much. So I always try to shoot for somewhere like lime green. For me, that's perfect. And it just makes it super easy to know if you have enough CO2 in your aquarium, you know? People are still coming to me with how many bubbles per second do I need for my CO2 system. And that's very hard to answer because it's different for every aquarium. It really depends on how much light you're running, how hard your water is. If you have very soft water, you may need less bubbles per second than in a tank with hard water. So for me, the CO2 drop checker is really the easiest way to measure CO2. So that's the last tip number 28. So that was quite a long video, quite a lot of tips. Hope some of them were useful for you. If some of them were useful, don't forget to smash that like button. And I want to thank you for watching. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.